Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating, highly consequential piece of political documentation. We are looking at the Democratic National Committee's 150-page 2024 autopsy report, which they've titled Build to Win, Build to Last. Now, usually after a historic loss, effective political parties dig into their data to figure out exactly what went wrong. And on the surface, that's what this document purports to do. But to truly understand this autopsy, we have to look at two entirely distinct layers. First, we'll summarize what the report explicitly argues caused the 2024 loss. But second, and honestly, this is the critical part, we really need to analyze what the report conspicuously does not address, because sometimes a document's silences tell us a whole lot more than its words.
And right out of the gate, we're hit with something completely bizarre. Stamped across the pages of this official 150-page blueprint for the future of the party is this recurring, highly unusual internal disclaimer. It reads, quote, "The DNC was not provided with the underlying sourcing and therefore cannot independently verify the claims presented." Think about the stakes here for a second. This is an official accountability document. It's meant to map out a 10-year recovery plan, and yet the very organization publishing it formally refuses to verify its own data. It immediately sets this tone of institutional dissonance, and as you'll see, that's going to play out across the entire report.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the official autopsy, the coalition collapse, and the media misallocation. Then we'll pivot to the stuff the report missed, the internal glitch, the glaring omissions, and finally, protecting the machine.
Okay, Section 1, the official autopsy. Basically what the report claims happened.
First off, the autopsy goes to really great lengths to emphasize just how historically close this election actually was. Yes, Donald Trump became the first Republican to win the popular vote since 2004, but he won it by a margin of about 0.15% of all ballots cast nationwide. So under the structure of the Electoral College, we're literally talking about tens of thousands of votes in just a handful of swing states, fundamentally deciding the whole thing. Now, when diagnosing the loss, the report points to a very specific timeline constraint. After the post-debate realization in the summer, we saw that late candidate switch from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris, and that created a severely truncated campaign timeline. Because of this compressed window, the report argues they experienced a massive candidate definition failure. Basically, the campaign struggled to define Vice President Harris as anything beyond just not Trump, or relying on that prosecutor versus felon narrative. And ultimately, that just wasn't enough to sway those critical, sophisticated, ticket-splaying voters.
Section 2, the coalition collapse. Demographic shifts.
The report painstakingly documents these massive demographic shifts that completely fractured the Democratic base. So the crucial point here is that this wasn't just a slight dip in enthusiasm. It was a total structural collapse across key demographics. They highlight what the autopsy explicitly calls the male voter problem, pointing out that almost every down-ballot Democrat performed better among men than the top of the ticket. We're talking dramatic drops in support among young Latino and Black men compared to 2020. Then there's the rural voter abandonment, which the report bluntly calls mathematically indefensible if you want to win swing states. And across the board, they tracked a marked rightward shift among non-college voters of color. To really put this into perspective, the specific regional failures they cite are just striking. In Nevada, Donald Trump won Latino men by 12 points. That is a complete, total reversal from 2020. And down in Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, look at Stark County. Stark County is 97% Hispanic, and it flipped to Trump. You guys, that county hadn't voted for a Republican for president since 1892. 1892. So the autopsy makes it abundantly clear. The party can no longer rely on assumption-based identity politics or traditional late-cycle outreach to hold on to these voters.
Section 3, the media misallocation. Always late versus always on.
The campaign's financial deep dive is really interesting because it illustrates a massive tactical disconnect. When you look at the combined media spending, the Democratic mix heavily skewed toward traditional broadcasting cable television. It accounted for over 55% of their total spend. But here's the catch. Younger voters, the exact demographic the party was hemorrhaging, are digital native cord cutters. They just don't watch traditional broadcast TV. So the report actually acknowledges that this spending mix actively disadvantaged Democrats, literally misallocating hundreds of millions of dollars into mediums that their target audience simply wasn't even watching.
Okay, so up to this point, the autopsy seems like a fairly standard objective postmortem, right? The candidate definition failed, demographics shifted, media money was misallocated. Makes sense. But what happens when the official story leaves out the biggest elephants in the room? This is where we need to shift our focus.
Section 4, the internal glitch. The paper shows through.
Remember that bizarre disclaimer from the beginning?
Well, scattered like graffiti in the margins of this official DNC document are these staggering internal reviewer notes. On page after page, you see red flag warnings like no source material or data provided, or data appears to be inaccurate and contradicts public reporting, even contradicts claims elsewhere in the report. We really have to ask ourselves, how can an organization build a reliable 10-year strategic blueprint on data that its own internal reviewers are explicitly calling out as unverified or outright contradictory? It strongly suggests a deep internal conflict over what the narrative should actually be. Section 5, the glaring omissions. What isn't in the report? If we track when campaigns identified voters in battleground states, it reveals a pretty striking detail. Notice how Michigan is heavily analyzed for late organizing here. The report notes that over 67% of voter IDs in Michigan were collected in October and November. But despite this microscopic focus on Michigan's mechanics, something incredibly crucial about the Michigan electorate is completely missing from the text of this 150-page document. The report completely omits any mention of the uncommitted protest vote. There is literally zero mention of Gaza, Israel, or Palestine. Nothing. And this is astounding because the report spends dozens of pages lamenting the desertion of young Black and Latino men, yet those are the exact demographics that were heavily represented in this massive, highly localized political protest movement that dominated the discourse in Michigan and other battlegrounds. To document the demographic collapse in such detail, but entirely ignore the primary geopolitical catalyst driving a major segment of that collapse, that is a glaring intentional blind spot. And we see this again with the economy. When evaluating the economy, the report acknowledges deep voter anger. They admit the campaign lost the 32% of voters who identified the economy as their top issue. But notice the framing here. It diagnoses economic anxiety primarily as a messaging problem, a failure of the Bidenomics branding. It treats the very real, very painful reality of inflation for working-class households as merely a failure of the campaign to use the right words. It completely deflects blame away from substantive policy failures and retreats to the comfort of a communications critique.
Section 6, Protecting the Machine, the 10-year plan.
So, after 140 pages of diagnosing the loss, the report finally lays out its majority party strategy. It's a 10-year plan to revitalize the party, but look at the actual steps they propose. Increase digital spend, retain organizing staff earlier in the cycle, improve technological data tools, and double down on existing infrastructure. Do you notice what's missing here? It entirely focuses on infrastructure and targeting optimization. It doesn't propose any fundamental shifts to address the deep policy disconnects or the moral and demographic failures it just spent an entire document mapping out. It just retreats to the exact same tactical playbook, hoping to execute it slightly earlier and on different screens. So, at the end of the day, we're left to evaluate this document not just for what it says, but for what it does. When a report documents the collapse of a historic coalition but omits the protests of its youngest members, when it frames crippling economic realities as mere branding errors, and when it proposes fixing a broken connection with voters by just tweaking the digital ad spend, well, we have to ask, is this actually a 10-year blueprint for a new party, or is it an exercise in institutional self-preservation to protect the old one? I'll let you be the judge of what those silences truly reveal. Thanks so much for diving into this with me, and we'll see you on the next Explainer.